Everybody, welcome. I'm Marcin. I'm here with Pamela Fox, our speaker here from Khan Academy. She will be speaking about accessibility and digitized education and talking about that. So without further ado, I'll let Pamela take away with the presentation, and afterwards we'll have time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them in the Slido link I've posted in the YouTube chat. That being said, let's get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. And here we go. All right. Can we see it? Can we get a thumbs up? Can you see it?
I can see it. I think you're good to go.
All right, fantastic. All right, so hello to all of you out there, whoever you are. And I'm very excited to be speaking at this hackathon. I think it is awesome that you are doing a hackathon with an education theme. I am personally very interested in education, seeing that I work for Khan Academy. And I think it's so fun to try and figure out how it is you can make education better, and is very relevant right now given that education is suddenly changing. So just a little background on me as we're getting started here. I went to college for computer science and also minored in linguistics and 3D animation. While I was at college, I did get to dabble a bit in education. So I worked in the Serious Games lab, and we actually made games that had educational goals. So we worked with the local fire department, and I got to take pictures of the fire engines and make them 3D. We worked with the credit union, and I got to make a game that would show your life savings over time in the game. And also, while I was at college, I started to develop curriculum for web development because I didn't think that that was being covered very well in our college degree. So that was my undergraduate and my master's. Then for my career, I've done a few things in the educational space. So I started off at Google in developer relations. If you haven't heard of it, developer relations is a really cool job where you get to help developers use your company's products, your developer products. So at Google, I was helping external developers like you use the Google Maps API. And the Google Maps API is a really fun API because you get to make maps, right? So, you know, I could show them how to make store locators or make a zombie shoot 'em up, like just all sorts of different maps. So that was really fun. You know, so I was making documentation and writing demos and giving talks and all the things that would help people learn how to make maps. So then after that, I went to Coursera. Hopefully some of you have dabbled in some Coursera courses. So Coursera puts courses from worldwide universities online, and many of them are actually free or low cost. And, you know, so you can learn things like machine learning, you can do a whole specialization in machine learning, you can learn things about irrational behavior. That was my favorite class on Coursera. So I worked at Coursera as a front-end engineer, actually writing a lot of the code for the original version of Coursera. So that was really fun. Got to do a lot of coding and also got to work with a lot of professors and see what it was that they were trying to get out of online education, right? Like they wanted to test their students a certain way or you know, do peer evaluation a certain way. So then after Coursera, I went to Khan Academy where I'm still here. And at Khan Academy, I both engineer the platform and develop the computer programming curriculum that uses that platform. So I find this really interesting because I'm trying to figure out how can we teach computer programming, web development, SQL, how can we teach that to hundreds of thousands of people online and try and do something that works for a lot of them. It's hard to do something that works for everyone. It's really hard. And we'll see that during this talk. But it's, you know, it's a good challenge and it's one I'd like to have. So that's my background. So now let's just talk briefly, like, okay, so you're at a hackathon for education. So you're probably, using computers and the internet to make something in the education space, right? So let's just see briefly, like, what does it mean to hack something in the education space? What does it mean to use computers and the internet for education? So we start off with digitizing the way we learn in classrooms. So obviously online videos are huge now, right? So Khan Academy has a lot and Coursera also has a lot. So we can put these videos online, and when we do that, we actually get some advantages from putting it online, right? So when you put them online, then when you're watching it, you can pause at any point where something's confusing, and you can rewatch parts that that you didn't quite get. You can take notes, you can view the transcript below a video. There's a lot of advantages that you can get from putting something online. And that's something that's great. When we start to digitize learning, we can think like, okay, what is something we can do with computers that we couldn't do in the classroom, right? Like if you ask your teacher to pause or to speak at 2x the rate, your teacher might say, no, I'm not going to speak like a chipmunk for you. But online, nobody knows that you're just watching Sal at 2 times the speed every day. So that's the kind of thing you can do. Obviously, there's also drawbacks to videos, right? You're not having this person, right there with you. So if you just do not understand the way that that teacher explained a concept, you can't say, teacher, I don't get it. Can you explain it a different way, right? So there's benefits, there's drawbacks. And I think we always need to think about the benefits and the drawbacks when we're talking about digitizing learning. Then we can also put practice online, right? So in a classroom, we'd be doing something on worksheets or on chalkboards. Online, we can do things with forms. If we're learning something like programming, we can actually program online. So on Khan Academy, we have programming challenges that are auto-graded. And so they'll give you little messages to say how close you are and to encourage you to, to keep working on it. So we can do a lot of stuff with online practice, right? So there's benefits here that, we can track to see how you're doing. We can give feedback, based on selecting the wrong answer. We can see how difficult things are for people, and we, can modify the questions to be better. But there's also drawbacks, right? You don't have somebody in person with you. If you're just really struggling on this challenge and it makes no sense, you might get really frustrated, right? So benefits, drawbacks. Another thing we can do is put simulations online, right? So if you don't have, access to something in your classroom, and at this point, very few people have access to things in their classroom because you can't go into classrooms at the moment, but you could do it online. So if you're in a chemistry, biology lab, and you wanted to do gel electrophoresis, that's a DNA processing step, you could actually do an online simulation. This is from Lab Exchange. So that's really cool that you don't have to have this whole setup, but you can actually do a little virtual lab. So that enables some things. Or frog dissection. I remember 8th grade, we were supposed to dissect a frog. I had some issues with that. Luckily, my dad, computer scientist, was working on a frog dissection Java applet. And so I was able to use the frog dissection Java applet and not have to dissect a poor little froggy. Right. So there's also, it opens up some things for people with different ethical concerns. So that's really exciting. But obviously a simulation can't help you understand, the nitty gritty of a frog or breaking your beakers in a chemistry lab. So there are drawbacks. And then a lot of times when we do talk about, using computers for learning, we talk about personalization. So the basic, the most basic personalization is just tracking your progress and saying, oh, you did this, what should you do next, right? That's a very basic personalization. That's very easy for a database to store that. On Khan Academy, we've gone further than that. We're doing mastery learning, where we track to see how often you've seen particular types of questions, how often you've gotten them wrong, and we keep leveling you up until we consider you mastered. If it's been a while since you've seen something, we pop up a mastery challenge and say, hey, maybe you want to review this concept, right? So this is all based on mastery learning. So that's a high degree of personalization. It's still not the most personal thing you could come up with. And, we hope one day to be exactly that, but it, takes time. You could also personalize by offering recommendations, saying like, oh, if you like this thing, you might like this other thing, right? So Coursera recommends whole courses. On Khan Academy, we recommend particular questions, right? So there's a spectrum of recommendations that you could give. Okay, so that's just laying the groundwork for, what does it look like when we're digitizing education, putting it online. So now I want to talk about aspirations. Like when we do that, we want these educational experiences, we want them to be globally usable. We want them to be accessible by people with any sorts of impairments or different learning styles. We want them to be inclusive to everyone, and we want them to be equitable, right? That is what we would hope for education. So let's talk about what does this look like? What do these mean? So global. So we want them, usable by the whole world, right? There's billions of people in the world? I always forget, but quite a few. So ideally, we'd be doing things that would be usable by the whole world, so that everybody is getting a great education, because we never know where the next great idea is going to come out. It could come out from any country, right? So we want to be educating everywhere. So at Khan Academy, we have translations into, I think 40 languages about. And so that's really cool. So people have gone through from those countries and translated our articles and our exercises and our videos into other languages. So if you visit, this is the Hindi version of the site or the Czech version of the site, then you can see the same question, but translated. So that's the start, is actually translating it into different languages. But it gets a little tricky. So some languages are what's called right to left. So English is left to right. That's how we read it. We go from left to right. But some languages are right to left. And some of these languages are really big languages. Arabic, Urdu, Persian, those are some examples. They have a lot of speakers. And we are missing out if we can't have if what we make is not usable by RTL languages. So Khan Academy doesn't actually have great RTL support yet because it's quite tricky. You can see this example here. You kind of have to mirror your website and make everything, work from right to left. And there's particular ways that you design it, like where you put the icons, how you align your text, all of that. So this is something that's good to keep in mind from the beginning before you get too far, is how does this thing, look if I try to make it work in an RTL language, right? So another thing to think about is mobile access. So mobile phones are a hugely popular in many countries, more popular, than we think of them here. Like here, a lot of us maybe have laptops, but in other countries, mobile phones would be the primary way of accessing a computer. That would be your computer, right? And actually, those folks that have mobile phones are often better at using their mobile phones than we are here in America, because we have so many laptops that we're good at that. We're not necessarily as good as using our phones. So imagine you've got all these folks that use a ton of mobile phones and they're really good at using them. They need mobile applications. They need to be able to access whatever you're offering from from their mobile phone. So for Khan Academy, we have a mobile app, but we also have a mobile optimized web experience. So you could go at it either way. An application, requires writing more code and bundling it like an application. So we've got a separate code base for our Khan Academy mobile app, whereas a mobile optimized website is usually about using CSS media queries and also just making sure that you're performant, right? If your website takes a minute to load, that's too long to load on a mobile phone. So those are the sort of things to think about for mobile support. Now, even if they can access it on a mobile phone, it might be expensive. If you're in a country which has an expensive data plan, right, for your phone, and you only get a certain amount of gigs per month, and otherwise you have to pay a lot of money, you may not want to, use the Khan Academy app to watch a video, because that might blow your whole data budget for the month, right? So because of that, a lot of folks do something called zero rating. So zero rating is when you work with a partner, like a telephone operator in the country, you work with that partner to say, listen, can you not charge your customers for viewing things on our website, right? So Wikipedia Zero, this was a project that Wikipedia did to do zero rating, and they did it, they worked with 97 telephone operators in 72 countries, and they were able to give access to about 800 million people through this program. So there's 800 million people that were able to access Wikipedia without having to incur any data charges, right? So that's one example of a program. They're actually not running that anymore for reasons. Facebook has a similar program. Khan Academy, we've done some of this in the past as well. We're not currently, but it's something that we would aspire to, because especially right now with COVID-19, especially if you're doing something like videos, which take up a lot of bandwidth. So this is also something to think about, is how much are people paying to use this thing over mobile. And then finally, not everyone is going to have a great working connection all the time, especially once again for videos. Like we're at a point where, in this country, well, where I am is the US, not sure where everyone else is, but a lot of us. So in this country, we mostly have good enough internet access that we can watch a video, but that's not necessarily the case in all countries if they're still on lower speed internets. So there you want to be able to download the videos offline. So a lot of apps will, give an option for downloading videos, but there's actually an app called Colibri, which specifically is designed to really make it easy to download a video and download all sorts of learning content. So they bring in Khan Academy content, but they also bring in other content as well. And they've really thought through, how do you get this educational content onto a device that does not have a strong connection? So you can read more about how they do it on their site. But that is something to think about as well, is, can you support some sort of offline access? Okay, so we've made it global, great. As you saw, that was kind of hard. But now let's talk about accessibility. So accessibility is often talking about making sure something works well for folks with hearing impairments, visual impairments, or learning disabilities. So the thing you can start off with is just making sure something is keyboard accessible. A lot of folks, we like mice, here's my mouse, and use a mouse for things. But there's many folks who use a keyboard, either because they prefer a keyboard or a mouse is too difficult to use for, reasons like maybe they have a shaking hand or something like that. A keyboard is easier to use. Or if they're visually impaired, they're more likely to use a keyboard. So whenever possible, make sure that what you're making works well with a keyboard. So the screenshot I have here is of a block programming environment called Blockly, and they've been working on keyboard support. So you can click through, see the demo. Actually, I can show the demo. So enter accessibility mode. And so you can see I'm doing WASD right now, I'm typing the keys. So I can go through and just using the keyboard, I can select all these things. Normally, this is something where you drag the blocks, but they've been trying to figure out how can they make this be keyboard accessible so that folks who can't drag are able to use it, right? So don't assume someone's going to use a mouse. Okay, so the next thing you want to think about is screen readers. If somebody is visually impaired, they will probably be using a screen reader. If you haven't experienced that before, you can try it on your Mac. It will actually read aloud the web page or the application. It'll read it aloud, right? So a web page is written in HTML. So it will actually read the HTML tags. So I put some, a page here. So you can imagine that the screen reader would say, heading 1, all about cats. Paragraph, want to learn about cats. H2, so it'll read it like that. And folks that are used to using screen readers, they can read through a page super fast when they've gotten very used to it. But the important thing is that you need to use semantic tags in your HTML. Okay, so, don't do just a bunch of divs. You got to be using P and the H's and the ULs. Hopefully, if you know HTML, hopefully this doesn't just sound like gobbledygook. So please use semantic HTML, the most semantic tag you can. Be specific. It will help the screen reader, right? Because those folks, they can't see, but they can hear. So imagine as you're writing your HTML, imagine that somebody is hearing your HTML, and that is the only way of interacting with your page. Also, very importantly, is if there's an image in the page, they can't see that image. So you need to describe that image. So make sure any images you're using should have alternate text that describes them, right? Because it's really important that they know that you put a photo of your adorable fluffy cat on the page. So you have to have alt text for that. Another thing that you could do, this is for the deaf community. A lot of them use ASL. I don't know it, but this is an example video from Apple. And this is somebody actually explaining how loops work. So he's saying, oh, you could loop once, you could loop twice, you could loop any number of times, however many you need. So he's explaining that in ASL. So that's really cool. So somebody who is deaf, they could read an article, sure, but this is somebody who's like speaking their language, is speaking ASL. So they could watch these videos and get a more intuitive understanding for, oh, that is what loops are in programming. Okay, now I understand that. So that's something to keep in mind as well. In Khan Academy, we are trying to figure out how to do ASL explanations as well, but we haven't got there yet. You could also think about physical interfaces. If any of you are doing hardware, this is something fun you can hack. So one approach to learning programming, we saw the keyboard accessible block programming, but you could also, if you were blind, you could actually use these physical blocks and you could toggle things on the physical blocks. And then that would equate to changes, in the screen. And probably you'd be doing something related to music, right? That's another general thing, is think about having both visuals and audio, right? Because then if somebody's missing the visuals, they can get the audio and vice versa. So this could be a fun hardware approach. This is something that's new that's come about. And there are folks that when they see a lot of motion, like a lot of animation, it triggers a response, which is called motion triggered vestibular spectrum disorder. And they have that sort of response if they see something like shaking on a page or parallax scrolling, those sort of things, maybe confetti. So what you can do is a lot of operating systems will let users say that they prefer reduced motion or no animations. And in HTML, if you're doing a website, you can use a CSS media query to see if they have, they've disabled that. And then you could take the animations off of the things on your website, right? Because some of us, some folks love them, like, yeah, confetti, all the confetti. But for other people, it could be really triggering and you don't want to have that bad experience. So this is something to keep in mind as well. At Khan Academy, what we've done is we also have a box on the settings where people can say that they prefer reduced motion. And we, based on that, we give them less animations. So you can use the media queries, you can have a setting. Just something to keep in mind is that not everybody loves when everything is just going. Sorry, people didn't like that. Oh, I did an example. Let's see. All right, now let's talk about making things inclusive. So one way of thinking of inclusivity is, can all users see themselves in your product? Do they feel like they belong? Do they see themselves mirrored? That's one way of thinking about it. So starting off with just names. If you're using names, like on Khan Academy, we use names for the exercises, right? And if I was just doing, names for my family, they'd be all like British names, Pamela and Heather and Hunter and stuff. But then there'd be lots of folks who would never really see themselves in the exercises I was writing because I was just doing it, based off of names that I knew. So what we have actually at Khan Academy, we have a random name generator that pulls names from lots of different cultures. And so that way we just use that whenever we're writing an exercise. And, hopefully somebody who has that name one day will see the exercise and go, wow, I feel like I belong. So, it may not feel like a big deal to people who have like names that, they've never been called out on or anything, but there's actually a lot that revolves around names in cultures, right? They've done various studies that resumes with, non-English sounding names don't get hired as much, that sort of thing. So, we need to be much more inclusive of names and not be biased about thinking like some names are normal and some aren't, right? Like just all names should be just fine. Gender inclusivity. There's a range of genders. I found this definition of gender, a non-binary association of characteristics within the broad spectrum between masculinities and femininities. And so that's something to think about as you're designing anything that's user-facing or mentions people, is how are you thinking about gender? How are you storing gender? How are you asking for gender, right? Like, because you can imagine like, that you could store gender as just a Boolean, like male or female, that would be, incorrect and wouldn't encompass the range, the spectrum of gender, right? So you could store it as a string, or even you could store it as an array of strings, because then people can identify as, multiple genders, right? Because gender is complicated. So I thought that I found this great drop down the other day when I was filling out a form where you could select from a huge range of gender options and you could select multiple of them. So I thought that was really inspiring. So I stuck that in here and wrote a little code to show you what it might look like in your database. So think about that. And also just think about the pronouns you're using on your site, if you assume certain genders or not. Sexual orientation, also, we have a spectrum of sexual orientation. We have, on Khan Academy, we have a few exercises like this one that recognize, here we have a lesbian orientation. So it's Brittany and Sophia went to lunch with their blank every Saturday. And so the answer is either wifes or wives. And now, of course, the answer is wives, because that's how we spell it in English, right? So here, when somebody sees this exercise, if there's somebody who has a wife, they feel like, oh, wow, like Khan Academy is recognizing that people, that women can have wives, right? So we've actually gotten some great feedback from this exercise where people have written and been like, oh my gosh, I felt so seen. I felt like I was, I felt like I belonged. Thank you. This has actually cheered up my day. So think about that, like you can make people feel included that haven't felt included before due to our historic bigotry. Multilingualism. Okay, so we have lots of folks in this country, but also other countries who speak multiple languages, and maybe they're fluent in both. Maybe they're stronger in one versus the other. So like in America, we have a lot of folks who speak, or in California, a lot of folks speak English and Spanish, and they might be stronger at Spanish than English, but maybe their classrooms are in English, right? So like in Khan Academy, you can do stuff in English, but then you could actually switch to Spanish. And my colleague for for a recent hackathon, he made a little Chrome extension where you could, when you were on the page, you could just switch from English to Spanish, right? So that's really cool, where you're on a website, you're doing it in the language that you're not quite as good at. And if you get stuck, you could just switch it to the language that you feel more fluent in, right? That's really recognizing the fact that people can have multiple languages at their disposal. So if you're able to have your site translated and allow that switching, then that's really cool. There's similarly a concept called translanguaging, which is built on the idea that there's lots of multilingual students, and trying to figure out how can you take advantage, how can you recognize that bilingualism is actually, it's a benefit, not a hindrance. So how can you enable students to incorporate multiple languages into what they're working on? So I found this curriculum here where students, they watch a Spanish telenovela, and then they code their own telenovela. They're using Spanish to do the coding and the dialogue and stuff like that. But there's also a lot of English in the lesson too, and it's all translated into English and Spanish. So I thought this was a really cool way of, mixing languages and bringing other languages in. So think about, how can you embrace multilingualism as a benefit to learning? Bring multiple languages in. And then also multiple cultures, right? So how can you recognize like all the different arts and histories and cultures of the many folks we have in this world? So this here was a tutorial about the history of cornrows. So it starts off with the history of cornrows, and then it talks about coding cornrows. So we talk about rotation and loops, talk about functions, and like if you make a little Z shape, so you have the function to make the Z shape, and then you repeat it. It's really cool. And I found it a fascinating history too. So that's really neat. Similar one with henna, talking about all the cultures that practice henna, and then coding your own henna tattoos and doing some radial symmetry. So thinking about that and trying to include a lot of cultures in what you're teaching. All right, so finally, let's talk about making things equitable. So when we talk about equitable, we think about things being fair and just, and oftentimes it's really helpful to look at impact versus intention, because intentions can often be good, but have an inequitable impact. So I'm gonna emphasize that. So along that line, I was reading this blog post from LinkedIn the other day, and they've been trying to measure the impact of the changes they make to their site on equity. And the way they do that is they look at people's, how big their social graph is, so how many people they're connected to on LinkedIn. And generally when people are really well connected on LinkedIn, it usually makes them easier to find jobs because they know all these people, right? But they want to close that network gap. They want there to be less inequity between folks with small networks and folks with big networks, right? Because if you're good for the job, you're good for the job. It shouldn't matter how many people you have, right? So they figured out how to measure the difference in equity that results from any changes they do. And they did this in their A/B testing framework. If you haven't heard of A/B testing, it's something that we do in software engineering where we try an A version of a feature, we try a B version of a feature, and we measure the results, right? So normally you say like, oh, well, we got more signups with B, so we're gonna go with B, right? Now what LinkedIn did, they said like, okay, we're not gonna just look at the average, we're also gonna break it down and say, if we got, if more people got jobs from B, but it was only people that were already super well connected, and the people that weren't well connected got less jobs, then that's not good, right? So they would say like, okay, we're not going to do that feature because it increases the inequity on the LinkedIn platform. So they're only going to do the features that actually decrease the difference between folks with a small network and folks with a big network. So just something to keep in mind is, how can you measure the inequity on the thing you're building? And how can you incorporate that into the product design process? So something specifically to just talk about in terms of education is that there's something called tracking. Tracking is when students get designated for different paths based on their academic performance at some point in their career. So it's like a 9th grader, if they don't do well in math, someone might say like, well, we're not gonna have you go into the computer science curriculum, right? We're not gonna have you go on that pathway. And that's really sad because like, one, we don't know how much better they could have gone at math. And two, actually computer science doesn't need that much math. So, tracking, that's a little secret. So tracking is, is really dangerous and is something that's very prevalent in classrooms right now. So you can see when we do tracking, you end up having a lot of inequity in the advanced courses, and versus like the vocational courses. So just think about whether you're accidentally doing tracking in your product. Like we think about this at Khan Academy, because imagine if we had two courses like chemistry easy and chemistry hard. Imagine a teacher might say, I think I'll just put this student on chemistry easy because they didn't do as well on this one test, right? They've then doomed that student for the rest of their career because they didn't think that they were up to the challenge, right? So you don't want to make it easy to do tracking. You also want to think about whether you're accidentally creating something that has a dependency on computers and the internet, given that there's a large number of people that don't have an at-home computer, don't have strong at-home Wi-Fi. This is something we're very aware of right now because of COVID-19 and everybody suddenly have to go online. And so there's various efforts like giveinternet.org, which is a nonprofit, trying to donate internet and computers. So this is something just think about, like what happens if somebody doesn't have that at home. So at Khan Academy, we've been trying to partner with organizations like this to get computers and the internet to everyone. But you could even create your own nonprofit to do that, right? Like in Illinois, make a new nonprofit to do that. Sure, you could hack that right now. Just do it. Just saying right now. So that's something to keep in mind because that's a huge piece of it, right? There's so many pieces of the education puzzle and they all have to be tackled. And I just covered a lot, so I don't expect there's any way anyone's going to cover everything because it's really hard and I don't think it's figured that out yet. But you can carve out different pieces of it, or pizza. Now this is kind of more sobering. Don't accidentally create a service that could be used for punishing someone. So I don't know if you all saw this, but a girl got sent to jail for not doing her homework during the pandemic, right? And that sucks. That's horrible. That shouldn't happen, right? So we think about this at Khan Academy, like, okay, we want to give teachers these tools so they can see where their students are struggling, but we don't want teachers to be using these for penalizing students, right? For punitive measures. And we don't want districts to be using it to like kick people out, right? So maybe it's something where when you work in districts, maybe you have an agreement that says, I agreed not to use this for punitive measures, right? Something like that. So, think about how it is that people are going to use it. And if they're going to accidentally use it to do policing and penalizing, that shouldn't be happening, right? Like we're trying to help people, not put them in jail. That sucks. Okay, sorry, I ended on that one, but that's the thing, actually. Like, with great power comes great responsibility, and when we're transforming education, we have to keep thinking in mind the good and the bad, the benefits, the drawbacks, the risks, how we can make things better. So, as whatever you're building now or in the future, keep in mind making it global, accessible, inclusive, and equitable as much as you can. And that's all I have.
Wow. That's all you have. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of useful information at that too. I think there's a lot that you can take from each section of like what you can potentially incorporate. But like even you yourself said, Khan Academy isn't necessarily even able to include all of these features because there's so many things that we can do to improve accessibility and to improve education. Mm-hmm. I think I'll start off with a difficult question, but one I think is like fair to lead up with. What do you prioritize?
Oh, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, at Khan Academy, we've often prioritized language translating because it's just there's such a huge number of speakers of non-English languages, and when you're learning something, maybe you understand English a little bit, but if you're trying to learn something new for the first time and it's a difficult concept, you don't want to have the cognitive load of both translating into your native language and trying to understand that new concept at the same time. So I think we've tended to do a lot on the translation front. We've also done a fair bit on the accessibility front. There's just always more to do, but we have done a lot. Part of that is because it's actually a requirement for many schools and partners that that you have to be accessible. So like higher ed organizations, I think legally have to follow certain accessibility guidelines. So like higher educations that put videos online have to have transcripts. If they can't, it's actually illegal. So that's good. Like, I mean, sometimes regulations are really helpful because they give people a way to prioritize things that we would love to do. But you're always prioritizing things, right? So I think that's what we've often done. Lately, we've been thinking a lot more about the equity side of things, right? And, you know, trying to figure out, because I think we've all seen in the last few months that inequity is rampant in the US. All over, you know, we've seen in the police, but that trickles down to education as well. I've, you know, recently been reading, I don't know, I've read about 15 books about the history of the US in the last 2 months. And my mind is blown. The way I learned history in high school is not really how it happened. And yeah, and that makes a huge difference, right? Like if, you know, if we can somehow bring to light all the inequity that the US history has caused, and then find ways to approach it, that would be amazing. So to me, I think that equity and inclusivity is very high in my mind right now, but it's all over. So it could be also just depends on what you're working on. Maybe it depends on where your expertise lies. So prioritization is hard. That is always true in software engineering and product development. But you know, I wish you well.
Yeah, I totally see that. I just want to like highlight what you said about accessibility, that partnering with a lot of these organizations, there are certain guidelines that you need to follow. So if you want your project to be taken seriously, to potentially be, you know, implemented, you have to like follow these guidelines. I think that's really important to highlight. So a question from somebody: what's a thoughtful but relatively simple first step to make our hackathon project more accessible? So what's sort of like a good first step for starting to build accessibility, in your opinion?
Well, if you're doing something that's web-based, you could, you know, you could just do an accessibility audit of the thing you're developing. So you can do, I mean, first just validate your HTML. A lot of people that's the bare basics. But then if you also, I think it's probably search the Chrome extension store for like an accessibility audit Chrome extension. We have one called A11Y that we use at Khan Academy, but there's various extensions and websites that will just audit your website for you. Because if you're new to it, you know, you probably don't know what to look for. So I would say, you know, run it through one of those audit tools and, you know, see what it comes up with and start there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think for a lot of platforms are probably web-based, so that will definitely assist in that.
Yeah, and also I'll let you know that when we do this like professionally, we often have a third-party service do an audit of our stuff. So it's very hard for anyone to be an expert at accessibility. So, you know, you do what you can, you know, check it with all the services you can. But then when it actually comes to, you know, really putting something out there for production use, there are services that will audit for you. So I remember at Coursera, one of my first projects was going through like 10 pages of feedback from one of these services and fixing up all these things and doing keyboard accessibility and whatnot. And then at Khan Academy, we recently did something like that as well, where we went through all this feedback from this auditing service and fix it up. So that's how it often will happen, you know, in a company that can pay for it.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. So I'll ask this question. Hello, student from India here. We use American technology a lot, but the biggest educational websites here are Indian. Why hasn't, oh, the question disappeared. Why hasn't GLB, globalization, extended to education? I believe that's what it's saying. GLB LZTN.
Okay, yeah, that was probably just a way of writing globalization.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, I mean, I know Khan Academy, we did recently start up a Khan Academy India team. I think the interesting thing with India is that there's a lot of languages spoken. So I showed a screenshot from Hindi, but there's also Kannada, and there's a bunch more. I'm just thinking of which ones we translate into. So a lot of times maybe the hard thing is, if you don't have someone on the ground in that country. So that's the approach we've been taking at Khan Academy, is that we actually have folks who work in India. We also have folks who work in Brazil, and I think Mexico. And they know their country, they know the language or the languages, and they can reason about what's the best way to bring it there. Because when we try to do that from afar in America, we might not really understand the best way to do it. So I think that's something, is like figuring out, so that students from India, maybe what works really well is if that student from India can partner with a team from America, right? And say, listen, I can show you, what's the way to bring this to India? What languages does it need to be translated into, to have an impact? Who needs to know about it? What's important to us? Is it mobile? Is it mobile web? Is it desktop, etc.?
Nice. The next question asks, hackathons have historically run in those very experienced in programming / coding mavens. What step can organizations take to avoid that tracking and reach all? Earlier, I remember you were talking about academic tracking.
Yeah.
So I believe this is referring to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I have some like blog posts about this, about making newbie friendly hackathons. And I think Hack Illinois does some of this. But so it helps when hackathons encourage non-programmers to come in. So that's designers, product folks, business folks, marketing folks, people who write stuff. I mean, anyone, right? But it means more effort has to go into the team creation process, because those folks need to be able to find a team, or a hackathon can reward the creation of ideas, right? So if you don't have time or knowledge to code something, you can make a paper prototype, right? Like you could literally draw something on paper or use PowerPoint to show what it would look like. And that's still very much, something you've worked on, and you can, do the research around it. So that can happen in the because Khan Academy, we have internal hackathons a few times a year, and they're open to all employees, but we have many, many employees that don't program, right? So sometimes they work with engineers, but other times they might just, do a lot of research and do a little diagram of what they, think would be a great idea. So I think it's both, coming up with ways to bring in those other folks, letting them know that they're specifically desired. I know some hackathons will, like, when you register, will specifically have something like, I am a designer, I am a product person, right? So then that, oh yeah, this hackathon is looking for me, right? And then putting effort into team formation and mentors. But then I think I also would reward non-technical projects too, based on ideas and pitches.
Yeah, that's definitely useful for us staff for future hackathons and organizations, and like potentially other events if their people get to see this video, see this question. Definitely helping those people. This is an interesting question. So how do you figure out what part of your product is the least accessible friendly? Like, I know we talked about prioritization earlier. This is sort of a play on that, but this is like, how can you identify sort of like let's say this like pain point in your audience that there needs to be accessibility a part of this, even though it may generally be low priority?
Yeah, I mean, you could ask someone who has that particular, I mean, when you say accessibility, there's so many different types of, impairments we're talking about. So you could ask someone who's visually impaired, but you're not going to get then the feedback from someone who's hearing impaired, right? So one thing is just to, but if you do get some of those folks or a range of folks to try it out, you'll get feedback, which is great. So if you could find that, I don't know if there's a way to like, I wonder how do you find those folks if you don't have them, if you don't know them? There's usertesting.com, but I don't think that that's particularly going to hook you up with folks with different impairments. So that's a good question about how you would find those folks. But I know whenever I do get feedback from from anyone in those categories, I pay very much attention, because if they went through the effort to email me about it, then it is a pain point, right? So paying attention to feedback is great, but if you can do some proactive outreach, that's really good, because they'll let you know. One thing I do is I find teachers who teach at schools for folks with different impairments, and then I try specifically to get feedback from them. So that's something you could do, right? There's like schools for the blind, schools for the deaf, or just folks in classrooms that have those students. And then I would still encourage to just find some accessibility audit tools, because that'll be a good start too.
Yeah, that's really great. What like the thing I want to highlight from that is get feedback from a diverse population of people if you can, and actively look for that feedback. Yeah, so let me think about another question. So we have another question here from somebody. Okay, this is like still sort of going along the same lines, but like another lens to it again. Somebody is asking, is it more important to tailor my application's accessibility, modification / addition to my target audience, or is it better to include as many as possible?
Well, I guess it's just when you talk about target audience, then it means that you may be leaving folks out and that you didn't know were in your target audience. Because what if the thing you're making, it actually turns out is really useful for this other audience? So for example, for Khan Academy, I recently released AP CSP practice content. And when I was building it, I didn't think that, it would be that, I didn't think it would be particularly used by folks with visual impairments, because I thought they would be using this other CSP resource called Quorum. But then I got an email from one of them that said, hey, this is the best resource I've found for CSP, and I have a visual impairment, and here are the bugs I ran into. So I was like, whoa, oh, wow. Okay, apparently the folks that I thought were not in my target audience were, and this is actually solving a huge pain point for them. And oh my God. So I spent that weekend just fixing every bug that they mentioned. And had I thought of that from the beginning, it would have saved me some work, because I did a few things in an inaccessible way because I didn't think it would come up, and it came up. But as soon as I found out that that actually this thing was a great tool for them. So I guess that's the one thing, is that it makes sense when you have limited time to prioritize for what you think your target audience is, but you might be surprised. The thing you're making could actually be something that's very relevant for a group you hadn't thought of. So it does depend, what it is you're making, and who's going to find it and benefit from it. So I think it makes sense to prioritize your target audience, but also keep in mind that on the web, anyone can find your thing, and you might find that what you're making is actually useful for other folks as well.
Yeah, I think that's like really enlightening. Like that's not, I feel like when we're talking about business or organizations, it's usually like, oh, I'm looking at my target audience, but to think that like,
I've actually been reading various things about design and the design process and equity around design. And they do talk about the danger of things like user personas and the average user and the target audience and whatnot, because very few people are the average user, and user personas are often trying to present this average user amalgamation, but really you have all these different users with so many differences, right? Like I might be, so for me actually, contrast. I didn't talk about contrast because I already had too many things in these slides, but visual contrast is something that's very important to me and to accessibility. If you're wondering about your contrast, you can use the color contrast checker tool online. So there's certain contrast ratios that you should have between the foreground and background text in order for it to be readable. And I find so many websites that are doing the gray text on white background thing, and it's just so difficult to read it. And I actually just email those websites and I say, hey, this fails the contrast ratio check. You need to fix this. So that's something that happens to be important to me. And it's particularly, the reason it's important to me is because I usually have my laptop in a low brightness mode because I'm typically working while my baby is napping on me. And I don't want it to be too bright that it wakes her up. So I'm always in this low contrast mode, which means if the website is also kind of doing this low contrast design, I just can't see anything. I just cannot see it. So it's interesting, right? If, that's one thing you'll find out with accessibility is if you start doing something like, oh, you hear like, oh, you need to do contrast because of, folks with vision impairments. If you just fix that for those folks, you'll also end up improving it for other people as well. And that's true of like almost every accessibility fix. If you fix it for, a certain impairment, you're just going to end up making it better overall for everyone. So, because everybody just has this range of ways that we use computers.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think that was probably our last question. So just to sort of wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like to emphasize or talk about?
Well, I think the thing I would want to stress is that what I presented is not comprehensive. There's a lot more that could have gone in here. This is a selection. It's a lot of things, but it's not everything. But just to get you to start thinking about the range of ways of making education for everyone. The other thing I would say is that I'm not an expert. I am learning all the time, especially on some of these things like on inclusion and equity. That's something I'm new to. So that's why I've been reading so much. So I also just encourage you to always keep learning about things, keep your eyes open for things that you can read to learn more about this, to learn more about the experiences of people who have been left out of things. And and eventually one of you will make a slide deck that will be more comprehensive than this. So yeah, keep that in mind, is that there's a lot of things to think about. Don't get overwhelmed that you can't do everything, but keep in mind the range of things and just always keep learning, keep researching, keep making things better.
Fantastic. So just one last note for our attendees. If you did attend this talk and you are here live, please feel free to fill out our attendance form for potentially putting yourself into a raffle for some goodies. So if you're here, I've posted into the chat the link and the password, which is accessibility100. So I just want to thank you again, Pamela, for joining us. I think this was very insightful into how we can make our software and platforms accessible, and not just like what we should prioritize, but like a wide variety of things for people to choose from and for people to consider. So with that, thank you and goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Happy hacking.